Yes, welcome. That's an American wedge.
Good morning. I'm Suzanne Maloney, Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy here at the Brookings Institution, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 20th Annual Raymond Aron Lecture. Today marks the 20th Aron Lecture. Over the years, this event has addressed issues such as climate governance, anti-racism in France, and global power competition, hosting experts such as Laurence Boone, Sandra Day O'Connor, and Philip Gordon, who launched the Aron Lecture when he was first here at Brookings and who has recently returned to Brookings as our Sidney Stein Chair. I would like to thank the French Foreign Ministry and the French Embassy here in Washington, D.C. for their continued support of this lecture series and for their abiding respect for our research independence. We could not ask for better partners. Special thanks to Agnès von der Mühll, Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of France to the United States. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing you in just a moment. This year's Aron Lecture is entitled The End of the Imperial Republic and the Future of the Transatlantic Alliance, a nod to Raymond Aron's seminal work published more than 50 years ago, The Imperial Republic. Aron saw 1973 as a watershed moment for the United States, marking a transition from global dominance to a new era defined by evolving challenges. That proposition seems particularly apt today. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 jolted the international community and forced an overhaul of European security. And isolationism and anti-establishment politics across Europe and the United States are straining the once dependable transatlantic alliance. The future of US-European relations hangs in the balance. I'm delighted to welcome our keynote speaker, Camille Grand, who is uniquely positioned to examine these issues. Camille is a distinguished policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He also teaches at the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po. Grand has served as Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment at NATO and has held senior positions in the French Foreign and Defense Ministries, as well as at prestigious organizations and think tanks across Europe. Camille's keynote address will be followed by a moderated conversation with Camille, Peter Rao, who is Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute, and my Brookings colleagues, Mara Karlin, who is a visiting fellow in our Strobe Talbot Center for Security Strategy and Technology, and Constanze Stelzenmüller, who is both the Fritz Stern Chair for Germany and Transatlantic Relations, as well as the Director of our Center on the United States and Europe. After their conversation, we will open the floor to questions in the room, as well as for those of you who are watching online. Staff will have microphones that will be passed around the room, and online participants can submit questions via email to the email address events@brookings.edu or via the hashtag Aron Lecture. We'll be streaming live and on the record. I'd like to now welcome DCM Agnès von der Mühll. Thank you.
Bonjour, since it's a French-American event and even a birthday. Thank you so much, Susan. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being there or online. On behalf of the French ambassador, who would love to be with you, but it's my pleasure then to represent him, and on behalf of the French embassy, I am absolutely delighted to welcome you on this special edition of the Raymond Aron Lecture, now in its 20th year. I don't see the cake, but the birthday cake should be around. I want to begin by thanking the Brookings Institution for hosting this event and for 2 decades of exceptional partnership. So our greatest and warmest thanks. I'd like also to express our particular appreciation to Cecilia Rose, whose leadership has expanded this institution global influence, Susan, that you just heard, Suzanne Maloney, for steady strategic guidance of the foreign policy program, Constanze Stelzenmüller, whose vision as director of the Center on the United States and Europe ensures the high caliber of our discussions is always vibrant and thought-provoking, so thank you so much. And of course, Tara Varma, who is somewhere over there, whose dedication, both as a scholar and as a French voice, I don't say the voice of the French embassy, but the French voice, within Brookings has been instrumental to maintaining the vitality of this conversation. Over the past 20 years, this forum has hosted a wide array of voices on the defining issues of our time. I would even say even beyond, because I was there 30 years ago and it was still very vibrant. Climate change, migration, economic interdependence, and hopefully remain so, great power competition, and more. And at its core, the Aron Lecture has always returned to the fundamental values we both cherish. This year's topic is especially timely. We're honored to welcome Camille Grand, and thank you for the Brookings, because it's the first time that we meet, but I heard a lot of times. So it's also a distinguished policy fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations and a long-time leader in European strategic circles, who has held senior positions, as you said, Suzanne, at NATO and even within the French government. Camille will be revisiting Raymond Aron's concept of the Imperial Republic, examining how it relates to Europe's evolving role in a world of rising threats and shifting alliances, and particularly the question of whether Europe is ready to assume greater responsibility for its own security. Be assured that President Macron will be a leading force in that. Following his remarks, he will be joined by two outstanding experts on European defense and strategic affairs, Mara Karlin from the Brookings and Peter Rove from the Hudson Institute. So you have also European roots. And I'm delighted to meet with you and continue this conversation. Constanze Stelzenmüller will moderate or animate, I don't know whether it's a moderation, what promises to be a fascinating conversation. The future of the transatlantic alliance depends on our collective ability to confront hard questions with intellectual honesty, strategic foresight, and sure purposes. That, I believe, is the most meaningful way we can honor Raymond Aron's legacy. Thank you again for being with us today, and please join me in welcoming Camille Grand just in front of me. Thank you all, and have a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Agnès. Thank you, Susan, for the kind words. It's really an incredible honor to deliver this 20th Aron Lecture. Of course, as a French scholar in international affairs, it's giving an Aron Lecture is quite special, but also going through the list of the incredibly prestigious speakers of the previous editions, it makes me even more honored and humbled to be delivering this with the remarkable speeches over the years. So it's really very much of an institution. So having the luck, I guess, to get the 20th anniversary is really special. So very, very special thanks to the Brookings Institutions, Susan, Constanze, Tara, who made this possible, Karlin, Ted, who facilitated all this participation. So when we started discussing this, I was under two instructions, to do whatever I wanted was instruction number one, but also to give it an Aron flavor because of the 20th anniversary. So I sort of reflected on Aron's writing to sort of try to identify what would be a good topic these days. And of course, as you know, he's written more books than one can probably read in a lifetime. And he's been this incredible commentator of writing on op-eds on a weekly basis for major French newspapers, having this extended correspondence with Kissinger and others over foreign policy issues, debating nuclear strategy, debating world politics. But ultimately, I ended up choosing, which is a bit risky in Washington, I guess, to his book about U.S. foreign policy, and to sort of reflect on why does that work. And to be fully honest, it started a bit with the title. I thought it was interesting, this idea of the end of the Imperial Republic, but then rereading it, because of course we always reread. French intellectuals never read a book for the first time. I had the privilege, I sort of discovered a book which was really very interesting to also think about present times. And that's pretty much how I sort of started unpacking this lecture. And that's what I'm going to try to do today. So to give you a flavor of that, I'll start by sharing with you some quotes from the book, so that to give you a chance to reread it in the future. So this is a book of 1973, which he titled a Contemporary History Essay. And it's called the Imperial Republic, the United States and the World, 1945-1973. It was published almost simultaneously in Washington and in the US and in France, and has been republished since quite regularly. His point is to say that under Nixon, the US foreign policy might be entering a different era, and he's noting the following, and here I quote, "The United States rapprochement with its enemies, the Soviet Union and Communist China, trade and monetary disputes with its European and Japanese allies, the narrowing of the gap between the wealth of the United States and that of its partners' rivals, the revolt of the Senate against the president's omnipotence, the massing of public opinion against the imperial burden, the arraignment of those who have been responsible for the war in Vietnam," are the way he frames this. Of course, any resemblance with current events, with the exception of the Senate revolt, would be entirely fortuitous, as Hollywood would say. But more seriously, the description of the post-Vietnam moment in US foreign policy offers an interesting echo to some of the current foreign policy debate. And there are very direct connections, including with the trade and disputes, with the disputes with allies over burden sharing. And as we all know, some of these conversations have been ongoing for decades. But I think what it's trying to pin here is that the 1941-1973 moment of US foreign policy might be coming to an end. As you've noticed, it was proven wrong. In a way, but I think some of his argument, and that has been ongoing for another 50 years. So it's going to be, I think, an interesting point of our conversation to see if my argument of saying that we are facing a similar moment is proven wrong. So the core element of his essay is to argue that the US foreign policy as it emerged after World War II, that he defines as the Imperial Republic, is unique and distinct from other forms of empires and imperialism, but that it could also be a parenthesis in US foreign policy compared with the longer run from the independence. Of course, the linkage between the two words, imperial and republic, are clever, but tends towards ambiguity. Interestingly, in researching for this paper, I found a book titled The Imperial Republic, written by a guy named Fenwald in 1898, that is at the Library of Congress, and that is a big expansionist, Western Hemisphere expansionist book about the fact that it's great to conquer. It's at the time of the Spanish War and so on. So it shows that there is some ambiguity in the title. But if we unpack his reasoning behind his choose of the terms Imperial Republic, is that Aron, who's an Atlanticist, a friend of the United States, refuses the term American Empire, and really distinguishes this Imperial Republic from more traditional forms of imperialism, including colonialism, and distinguishes it from European forms of imperialism, and suggests that it is also a more benevolent empire that is quite different from any forms of imperium before that. He opens his essay by noting that in the late 40s, and here I quote again, commentators were noting that for the first time in history, a republic had risen to the first rank without ever aspiring to the glory of dominion. As the price of its victory, it had to take half of the world in charge, guarantee the security of Europeans, too weakened to defend themselves unaided, and concern itself with all areas of the globe that were on the point of lapsing into chaos. He further divides the diplomatic history of the United States into three main periods, the first dating from 1983 to 1998, from the Treaty of Paris to the war with Spain, and the second from 1999 to 41 or 47, and here I quote again, the third, which began with Pearl Harbor or the Truman Doctrine. And he stresses that the key element of the first two periods, quoting again, taken as a whole, each of them contrasts with the other in essentials, whereas the movement of ideas and events from the end of the 18th century to the end of the 19th leads to systems divided and purposed by the founding fathers, a sovereign republic covering the greater part of North America, hence geopolitically insular from the end of the 19th century onward. The observer can discern neither the logic of the plot nor the aims of the actor. By the end of the last century, the national purpose of the founder of the American Republic had been achieved. Throughout the ensuing half-century, the Republic searched anew for a purpose and swung from one line of conduct to the other as whim dictated. So Aron captures well the essence of the pre-41 US foreign policy as seen by the Europeans when he further notes, and quoting again, that the insular power whose territory was sheltered from attack and which sent expeditionary forces to distant lands preserved until 45, the strange privilege of profiting politically from its errors, by its abstention, by spreading the illusion that it would continue to remain aloof from hostilities in Europe, by its inability to choose between compromise with Japan and a determination of which massive rearmament alone would have given convincing proof, the United States historically, and I'm still quoting Aron, bears some of the responsibilities for the outbreak of the twofold war in the Atlantic and the Pacific. From his perspective, the quarter of century of preeminence was the sanction, whether reward or punishment, of what everyone today calls an aberration, in that a great power upset the system quite as much as its refusal to assume its due rank, as by pride of primacy. To end with this, with the last quote, he really noted that at the time, in 73, that the Europeans are once more beginning to fear this refusal after denouncing that pride. So moving to today's foreign policy, indeed, we're familiar with the debate within the Republican camp. My ECFR colleagues have called them tribes, between the restrainers, the prioritizers, the primacists, and there is a renewed form of rather traditional isolationism that aims at limiting some U.S. engagements and presence abroad through burden sharing and or shifting, and a reluctance to take part in new conflicts after decades of costly wars overseas and untangling alliances in Europe and Asia. A consistent variant of this trend is the renewed form of very 1898 hemispheric imperialism, suggesting a focus on the Western Hemisphere, hence the comments on Greenland, Canada, or Panama. The renewed focus on the Indo-Pacific and the view of China as the critical challenge is also part of this broader conversation, leaving ultimately, and again in quoting or work at ECFR on this, the premises with the idea of continued global leadership as a sort of minority view from that perspective. It is clear that the President's instinct, as well as the views of many senior figures in the cabinet and senior national security leadership, are moving away from this third view of global leadership. This suggests that the Europeans are, in a way, right to fear or be concerned with a profound shift in US foreign and security policy, closing a long chapter open in 1941, as already feared by Aron in 1973. It is also probably fair to note that notwithstanding the policies and rhetoric of the President and the administration, that these trends affecting European securities are older and much deeper as the US faces multiple challenges, that the burden-sharing debate is almost as old as NATO, that the pivot to Asia has been on the table for at least since the Obama administration, that the public fatigue about forever wars goes well beyond the MAGA base. So in this context, and at this stage I will start refraining from lecturing further on US foreign policy in Washington, it seems appropriate to break down scenarios and challenges for the Europeans in this emerging new era. So here, and as the NATO summit is coming our way in now 3 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks, it is the, I wanted to try to spell out 4 scenarios for the future of the transatlantic relation, not so much at the summit itself, which is going to be a milestone, but it's a broader debate. And what is clear to me as we prepare for the Hague summit is that my 4 hypotheses, the 4 hypotheses that are taking shape, all point to a NATO, what one might want to call it 3.0, that is very different from the NATO 1.0 of the Cold War or the NATO 2.0 of the post-Cold War era. A NATO that is less American, fundamentally moving away from some of the core element of the Imperial Republic as defined by Aron. So the first scenario is that of an organized transition towards a more European alliance. In this scenario, the Europeans continue to increase their defense spending and work closely with the United States to build an alliance that is less dependent on American conventional resources, but without calling into question the American commitment and in particular the extended American nuclear deterrent. At the end of a coordinated evolution, probably spreading over a decade, NATO has become more European and a significant portion of the burden has been transferred, even if the United States remains committed to European security and US military presence in Europe endures. In a second scenario, the transition occurs, but in a chaotic way, through a succession of crises and rather unilateral decisions. So the United States decides to withdraw troops and resources without serious consultations with allies, further signals a reduction of its interest in the Euro-Atlantic theater, creating risks for European security, and no doubt forcing the Europeans to move away, to move forward at a form of breakneck speed. Such an evolution would be imposed by a crisis in Asia or unfavorable American trade-offs. The outcome is more or less comparable to the previous case. This scenario is not without risk for the alliance. In addition to inevitable internal political tension, the chaotic scenario generates moments of strategic vulnerability during the transition phase. Indeed, it becomes tempting for NATO's adversary, led by Russia, to test the solidity of the alliance and the robustness of Article 5 in such a scenario, for example, by multiplying hybrid attacks or conducting a limited operation against a Baltic state. In a third, more radical scenario, the administration may be frustrated by the lack of European progress, whatever the reality of that progress, and determined to reduce American commitment, pushes the logic to a form of withdrawal from European affairs, with or without priority given to Asia, to its logical conclusion. The logic is one of a radically reduced American participation in NATO and presence in Europe, even without effectively withdrawing from the Washington Treaty. In practice, and within the space of a few months or years, the United States will multiply the signals of disengagement, form of abandonment of Ukraine, rapid, massive, and coordinated troops withdrawals, closure of American bases in Europe, disinterest in NATO common functions, and possibly irreversible weakening of the American guarantee in the eyes of allies and foes. In this scenario, Europe would be entering uncharted territory since 1949, having to organize the defense of Europe without America, essentially, with painful choices to be made about the scale of the military effort and priorities, the need to urgently fill capability gaps and to reflect on the terms of collective defense, not based on an American guarantee that would be uncertain at best. At the same time, some allies will be tempted to seek alternative security guarantees, whether they are bilateral or unilateral arrangements, or even compromises with Moscow. Given the Russian perception of NATO as an essentially American-led alliance, the risk of a test on European solidarity and NATO's ability to react without American resources would be high. This scenario is the one Aron was concerned about when he feared a return to the pre-41 isolationism. From a European perspective, it would put an end to a cycle opened in the late 1940s that French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman described on the eve of the signature of the Washington Treaty. I quote, "We obtained what we had hoped in vain between the wars, that the United States recognizes that there is neither peace nor security for America if Europe is in danger." Fourth and most extreme scenario, a hostile United States from a European perspective. In this scenario, still unlikely, transatlantic conflicts over trade, technology, democratic values, and a form of quid pro quo with Moscow over critical issues such as Ukraine, sanctions, or disarmament lead to a historic breakup of the Western family that goes far beyond the traditional burden-sharing debate. In the form of extreme variant, American ambitions in Greenland take the form of military pressure, generating an unprecedented crisis in the alliance. At this stage, it should be noted that the administration formal declaration seems to rule out scenario 3 and 4. But the first scenario of an orderly transition seems neither guaranteed nor automatic. Even though the Secretary General of NATO and many European leaders are trying to build a shared and convincing narrative combining a case for a renewed transatlantic bargain and a new ambitious defense spending targets. It's also clear that Ambassador Whitaker has already publicly announced a debate on the reduction of the US military footprint after the NATO summit. On the other hand, it seems quite certain that the status quo, a sort of business as usual scenario 0, would not be acceptable for the United States, and that Europe needs to prepare to defend itself with less America, even if some European allies still fear the self-fulfilling prophecy and fear that they will not be in a position to cope with the strategic consequences of a radically new situation. In short, Europe still hopes to remain in the first scenario, while the Trump administration, from my perspective, but I look forward to the debate on that, might still be wavering between pressuring the Europeans to make fundamental judgments, it's a sort of scenario 2, or more radical move, which would be my scenario 3. So that leaves us, and that's my last section, with 4 challenges for Europe. In this context and in the security realm, Europe needs to address several challenges. The good news is that the blueprint is largely the same, whatever the scenario, and that there is a path to defending Europe with less America. It is demanding and somewhat costly, but can be achieved within a decade or less if 4 challenges are properly tackled from my perspective. First of all, building a European ability to defend Europe with less America or no America. That is a plea for a decadent Europe, to quote another book from Raymond Aron. The blueprint is well identified. I wrote a paper on precisely titled Defending Europe with Less America last year. That offers a decent to-do list. Other colleagues have recently looked into this further, and a recent IISS paper titled Defending Europe Without America even offers a figure of $1 trillion for European military investment to address the gaps created by a US withdrawal from the conventional scenarios, which is pretty much what Secretary Exet told the Europeans in February. So that requires the rebuilding mass and readiness to enable the Europeans to, what I call, provide the cavalry in the event of a crisis or a conflict, and therefore become the first respondent with some much more robust capabilities. It requires to address specific capability gaps. My point to European leaders has been to focus on critical enablers and high-end strategic capabilities. So intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, including long-range drones, space assets, airborne surveillance, strategic airlift, air-to-air refueling, and more broadly, military mobility enablers, electronic warfare, air and missile defense, conventional deep precision strike capabilities. And for that, the European Union can help the Europeans move faster by putting money on helping the European nations acquire those capabilities. This sounds demanding, but with proper funding over a decade, it is not out of reach. Europe and Canada spent somewhere between 200 and 250 billion a year 10 years ago. And if indeed the defense spending continues to grow, moving from the 2% average to 3 or 3.5, it will generate more than $1 trillion over the next decade of additional money for that, therefore making the IISS figure not out of reach. Second, the European defense industry has been gradually moving in more war mode and is capable of delivering most of the capabilities needed and benefits from a new focus and support from the member states and the EU. After all, the European civilian aerospace industry is very competitive, on par with the US and sometimes better, so there's no reason whatsoever why Europe could not deliver a large portion of the needed capabilities. Third, European and civilian military leaders have now finally understood that there is no plan B, that the point is, and have given up the poor policy of entertaining severe dependencies to keep the US on board, and seem ready to move at pace, even if there are massive differences in the European landscape between those that are already there in terms of level of effort, Poland, the Baltic states, those that are getting there fast, the Nordics, Germany, the Netherlands, those convinced and with a robust defense effort, but struggling with fiscal constraints. France, the UK, Greece would fall into that group, and those still hoping to dodge a significant effort above 2% anytime soon. Spain, Italy, Belgium would fall into that group. But all of this is, from my perspective, achievable, especially under the orderly scenario, which allows to get there step by step. Second challenge is to prepare and deter some of the extreme scenarios for European security. So this is where I quote another book from Raymond Aron, which is called The Great Debate, which is his book on nuclear strategy, where he argues that in the early 60s, there was this major moment of a nuclear conversation within the alliance, with the US having to reposition itself after the Sputnik moment and the vulnerability on the US territory, with France and Britain having to decide what sort of deterrent they were building, whether it would be closely connected to the United States or focused on a sort of independent construct, where other non-nuclear allies such as Germany were interested in having a say in decision-making and participating in the nuclear mission. It is, in my view, very interesting because I believe we're emerging on a new conversation on the nuclear front there, which probably happens once in a generation, sometimes in the late 40s, early 60s, as I mentioned, and late 2000. President Macron's statement on the European dimension of the French vital interest, the UK looking into rebuilding an air component to their nuclear deterrent, the German Chancellor calling for a European conversation, Poland discussing openly nuclear options point at the debate no longer confined in expert circles. It needs to take place in an orderly fashion, with the US making clear the level of commitment in the new environment, with France and the UK reviewing their role probably more profoundly than they've done so far, positioning on how they position themselves and what sort of capabilities do they need to contribute more, with the non-nuclear allies exploring how they can contribute more via nuclear, it's a dual-capable aircraft mission, or non-nuclear capabilities. It might well end up with limited changes or more fundamental ones, but I think this conversation is looming as part of this broader debate. In parallel, another major challenge for the Europeans is in the intelligence realm, and there again, there might be some use to it's a more complex debate given the variety of formats between bilateral arrangements, Five Eyes, NATO, and it's a more discrete one, obviously, but it's equally important for the Europeans to reduce their dependencies, and for both sides of the Atlantic to understand well how this will continue, including in the context of Ukraine. There is a third sort of immediate challenge, but that will last, which is the need to secure the future of Ukraine and thus of Europe with less America. To avoid another century, to quote a fourth Aron book of Total War, which is, the French title was Les Guerres en Chaîne, so it's the Wars in Chains, which was, it's a book of the late 1940s, which is pointing at the fact that there are connections between the conflicts. And there is a strong feeling in Europe that war is back. For many Europeans, Ukraine is not just another regional conflict to be stopped or not. The Europeans many Europeans are quite worried about these chain of global conflict that took place in the first half of the 20th century, and that the policies that we developed together since 1949 have helped prevent. So it needs to develop its own strategy to secure the future of Ukraine and thus the future of European security, which means combining continued assistance to Ukraine, and a robust one, inclusion in European security institution, and probably a sort of a post-ceasefire European force in Ukraine that is still to be discussed in details, and we know how complicated this is. Finally, there is a need to reinvent the post-Imperial Republic alliances and institutions. I'm a very strong believer in NATO, and I think NATO should stand. The point is not to let it go, but I do also believe that NATO 3.0 will be very different from the one we've seen before. Hopefully it will still be a solid transatlantic alliance, but it will also have a much stronger European pillar, making it more balanced and less American. This requires not only the Europeans to spend more, but also, honestly, the US to accept to let go in a form of new transatlantic bargain, as we titled the Belfer Center report on the future of transatlantic alliance earlier this year with a few American and European colleagues. But this requires ideally a structured, an honest conversation to develop a shared vision and a plan to build such a new transatlantic alliance. Is such a conversation possible? So in conclusion, as Europeans, I would argue that we need to assume that the end of the Imperial Republic is happening. We can hope that this is a path to a renewed, more balanced transatlantic alliance, to a NATO 3.0 in which the US would remain engaged and value allies. We Europeans have to also prepare for more complex scenarios. From that perspective, Raymond Aron's work offers, from this perspective, an extraordinary toolbox. Most of his writing, including the Imperial Republic, offers the types of rigorous analysis that can help it think through those challenging times. So on this note, thank you very much, and I very much look forward to the discussion with Mara and Peter and Constanze.
You will be there, and Camille will be here. Thank you. Merci bien. Merci. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us here for what was a terrific lecture. I'm really glad that we asked you. I mean, you're an old friend, and I would have asked you anyway. But this was the perfect way to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Aron Lecture here. Aron, as many of you know, was the incarnation of French transatlanticism at a time when it was not pas évident, as the French would say, and not easy to be a French transatlanticist. In fact, famously, he was a critic of French and European intellectuals' infatuation with Marxism and the Soviet Union, which in another famous book that you didn't quote, he referred to as the opium of the intellectuals. And he's I don't know whether he called himself that or whether somebody else said this about him. He was known as an immoderately moderate liberal, which is something that at a period of transatlantic politics where ideology and strong feelings have returned, I find a particularly useful and attractive way to engage with the world. On this panel here, which was introduced by Suzanne, but I'm going to reintroduce Peter Rao, our guest from the Hudson Institute, and good friend of COSC, the Center on the US and Europe, which I direct. I'm Constanze Stelzenmüller, sorry, I should have said that at the beginning. And my dear colleague Mara Karlin, who's back with us from a period of serving government. And Camille, of course, really was the perfect speaker for this. All of us here are, I think, transatlanticists in one way or another. We have different sort of roots on the other side of the Atlantic. The two of us are Europeans, two of us are Americans. But I think we all share a commitment, a belief that America is better off and stronger with alliances. Even if we do so with different political inflections, with different persuasions, I think we all share the view, if I haven't misunderstood you completely over the many years that I've known you three, that it is time for the Europeans to get a grip and to get on with things. I think we have a cooperation bias, and I think we probably all four believe that there is no way to an imaginary ideal status quo, be living in deeply disruptive revolutionary times. And some of the actors that we are dealing with and whose policies we're analyzing are indeed revolutionary. What we're going to do here now, we have an hour. I'm going to ask first Peter Rao and then Mara Karlin to respond to Camille's lecture, which they've read in advance. And then we will engage in discussion for a bit and finally open for 15 minutes of Q&A. And I also want to give another hat tip to Phil Gordon, who is our colleague again, who not only initiated this lecture 20 years ago, but in fact created the Center on the US and Europe. At the time, it was the Center on the US and France. We have since expanded its remit a tiny bit.
German takeover.
I'm the first German director, so it took a long time. Anyway, over to you, Peter, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Tara, for having me, and Suzanne. It's nice to see an old friend like Constanze here, and hopefully a newer friend in Mara from Brookings. Camille, congratulations on the lecture, and I'm honored to be here and say a few words in response. I'd like to start with the typology for which ECFR is well known for by now, this triptych definition of the national security right as consisting of restrainers, prioritizers, and primacists, and perhaps tease out a little bit the implications for the scenarios which you sketched out. And here I'd begin by saying that, of course, in government, which tends to be amoeba-like in shape-shifting, in that theory, when it meets practice, has to make concessions to reality, oftentimes leads to synthesis or less stark lines between those three groupings. But nonetheless, I think they are a useful mental map. If I could descend a little bit from the grand philosophical kind of discourse of Iran and down to the more practical politics of Washington, I'd make three small amendments to that typology, and then talk about the scenarios or the president. The first is that I think the primacists on the American right are a different constellation than they were 20, 25 years ago. And that is predominantly so because of the departure of the neoconservatives from the Republican Party. They have either gone over to the Democrats altogether, or they sit occasionally throwing a polemical punch or jab, but more or less working technocratically on the world as they see it. The Halcyon days of George W. Bush's second inaugural, the advance of freedom around the world, which really found resonance, I think, also in President Biden's administration, where the president himself, talked a lot about authoritarians versus Democrats, is really over. And so I think the primacists, as presently constituted, really would overwhelmingly consider themselves realists that someone like Kissinger, who was referenced in the speech, would recognize, keeping a balance of power on both ends of the Eurasian continent. Now, I think that description would be dismissed by some from the other two camps as essentially trying to pour old wine into new bottles, but I think there's truth to it. Secondly, I think the political foundations of the prioritizers is actually relatively weak. It's very difficult to unleash some of the forces of isolationism that have been unleashed in arguing against American support for Ukraine and arrest that at the Taiwan Straits. I think a lot of the arguments that have been marshaled will cause the American public, if it does come to a Taiwan contingency, to essentially leapfrog the prioritizers all the way to the restrainers. And so I think we are living in a way, and I believe this holds true for the world as well, in almost a bipolarity on the American right, where on one pole you have still the primacists. In the middle, you have a group of analysts who are prioritizers, but in the event, in the emergency, I think would find themselves going over into the primacist camp, while many of their political supporters, the political resonance they think they enjoy, would go over towards the restrainers. A lot of that, of course, also depends on where the president goes, because it's a pretty well-established feature of political science that the president sets the tone and that the American public tends to follow a lot what the bully pulpit sets out. It would be interesting as a thought experiment to think through where these schools of thought would go if a Democrat is at the helm, if there's a war over Taiwan or a crisis in the Indo-Pacific, Hainan Island, sort of upwards. But right now, as far as we can see over the horizon, it's President Trump, and it's probably too hazy to look beyond that for the next Republican or Democrat president. So it really comes down to, I think, where the president would go, and while there would be begrudging prioritizers, maybe critique of a president if he did not decide to fight for Taiwan or for the Philippines, which is a treaty ally, I think the public would probably, that scope of kind of prioritizers, public support, would go where the president goes. And then third is, of course, the restrainer camp. But rather than make a statement on the restrainer camp, which I think pretty much has been nailed dead to rights by the typology that ECFR lays out, my amendment would be that it's very hard to typecast Donald Trump at any three of these, because in the end, he is a populist at heart. And populists, by very definition, aren't really ideologues. There's some, I think, nuanced difference there. I mean, Trump does have clear views. His foreign policy begins with immigration. I can't count how many times senior cabinet officials have traveled to the border more so than other regions of the world. And I would agree that Camille's point about the Western Hemisphere falls into that sort of bucket. But if Trump were here, I think he would nod and smile if he were given a fourth kind of category, and that is Trump as the businessman peacemaker. I think that is how he thinks of himself. I think that's where he would typecast himself in kind of the American political foreign policy lexicon. And a great metaphor that was just offered a few days ago in the newspaper by an anonymous advisor to the president, but I thought really spoke volumes, was the idea that the president has constructed a golden bridge for the Russians, for Vladimir Putin, and the Russians risk burning that down or not taking it. And the golden bridge is a nice metaphor because I do think that the president thinks through principally sort of the pecuniary lens, the lens of finance, the lens of economics. And if only the Russians, if only the Iranians would understand that there's a better economic future, a glittering allure of normalization with the Americans on the horizon, they would take the opportunities that are being laid out before them. My, I think, friendly advice to the administration would be that, number one of the differences between foreign policy and business economics is that there's a greater shadow of the future in foreign affairs. And so while when you have a deal in commercial real estate, the deal stands and you've arrived at it, in foreign policy, how you arrive at that deal does, I think, affect allied behavior going forward. We aren't in the business of resolution. You don't solve things necessarily in foreign affairs, but you manage and you hand the baton off to the next president or the next administration. And so the shadow of the future is much greater, which means allied management matters, I think, a lot more. And the feelings are much more visceral in the way one moves the chess pieces than they might be if you're playing hardball in a real estate deal. Secondly, I think the president, for all of his kind of tough appearance, which I think is real, is less inclined to draw stark red lines. And I think the thinking of somebody like Ambassador Witkoff, there's a counterparty, so there's Constanze, there's me, we have a negotiation, and we'll try to meet somewhere in between. The danger there is that it means you're less wedded to red lines, and you begin to have reporting in the press that you're going to allow the Iranians to enrich uranium, for example, or that you might entertain a, not de facto, but de jure recognition of Crimea in negotiations with the Russians. A third is that because the president is so driven, I think, by commercial diplomacy, and when he looks out at the world, the metrics that matter are trade deficits and surpluses more than maybe the security alliance, it sometimes leads, I think, him to have less appreciation for history, culture, and some of the other factors that might drive the decision-making of someone like Vladimir Putin or Ayatollah Khomeini. So those are, I think, some factors that feature into this, I'd say, businessman peacemaker, which has a lot of advantages, but also those kind of nuanced qualities to them. As to the, briefly, the scenarios Camille laid out, which I'm sure we'll get into more in the discussion, I think the president's done a great job of exposing our friends and allies to just enough hostile power to engender a lot of burden sharing, without going so far as to risking a security crisis on the continent. But at some point, you have to convert the anxiety that you've created into concrete wins. And so I wish we were holding this talk here today, not on Wednesday, but on Friday, because I think tomorrow is a very important day. There's one country in Europe that has the fiscal space and the geographic location to truly put hard power in play, and that is the Federal Republic of Germany. President Trump's term and Chancellor Merz's will almost surely overlap over the next 4 years. They're both new governments. Friedrich Merz paid a big political cost for exempting defense spending from the German constitutional debt break. There's something like €1 trillion being talked about in infrastructure and defense spending coming out of Berlin. There are only 3 or 4 countries in the world that can put that sort of muscle in play: Japan, China, the US, and Germany. And so as we talk about a new order or how Europe reacts, I think it'll be interesting to see whether or not, based on tomorrow's conversation and also subsequent interactions that Europe has with the US, whether or not this increased defense spending, which apparently Germany is willing to undertake now in a real way, leads to burden sharing, so a European pillar within NATO, or it leads to hedging behavior, which will look the same in the short run because the top line numbers will be there. But there will be less contracts for American defense firms, many less contracts for American defense firms. There'll be less deference to American diplomatic initiatives. And there might even be a soft neutrality in Europe and Sino-American competition, none of which I think would be strong for Europe or good for the United States. So my advice or my hope is that the president, having succeeded in rattling Europe, producing anxiety, doing things like musing aloud about Article 5, can actually convert that now into rock-solid commitments. 5% of defense for Article 5 commitment, and then you have a more equitable and equal relationship. 2 quick points, because I know I'm going on too long. Number 1, I think we're far too solipsistic and self-absorbed in this discussion. The Russians will have a vote, the Chinese will have a vote, and our timelines will be dependent upon that in large part as well. And then lastly, we're at a moment where it's very attractive to talk about European capability and European independence, sort of this idea that's wafting about and that people are gravitating to. But all of the practical problems associated with it have not yet really been surfaced. Number 1, some of the capabilities which the U.S. provides, for example, like air interceptors. I think the Aster interceptor takes 40 months to produce, 40 months for one interceptor. You can do many at the same time, but for the SAM-T to be operational in Ukraine, you'd basically be out of missiles in the span of hours, if not days. How would Europe actually organize its defense? Right now, it's an American SAC here. Is France really going to defer to, say, a Polish SAC here? Is a German SAC here going to take charge? These are major structural issues. Europe, to me, is much more a mosaic than a unified whole. We talk a lot about Europe, but what happens when there's a cacophony of voices of smaller powers who have different views than larger powers do? How big should Europe be? Turkey might have the most capable military in Europe. It's not a member of the EU. Norway has perhaps the most fiscal space, given its gas holdings. The UK is not a member of the European Union, is one of 2 nuclear powers. All that, I think, needs to be worked through. So there's a great deal of hope, as I see it, that the president has surfaced issues, created anxiety, but now it's time to, I think, really move towards concrete operationalizing of this anxiety into capabilities in the context of the transatlantic alliance, and I think Aron would be proud of that.
All right, Peter, thank you very much. That was terrific, and in itself already a great compliment to Camille's speech. In the interest of time, I have many questions I would like to ask, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move straight to our colleague, Mara Karlin.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real treat to be here with Peter and Constanze. Camille, congrats on such a thoughtful lecture. I'd like to offer up 3 points for us to consider. And the first takes the long view. It was sweet, some might even say adorable, to situate us back in 1973. Right? And I suspect if I could poll everyone here, most folks would say, gosh, I sure would go back to that uncertainty. I sure would go back to that confusion in the transatlantic alliance, at least, compared to the challenge that we see today, where gaps have in many ways become gorges. You know, it is worth reflecting then when we're taking that time horizon, just how lucky, how grateful we all have been for the last 80 years, right? We, if you are sitting in this room, are no doubt quite familiar with the accomplishments of the last 80 years of this post-World War II order, and yet we are all quite cognizant that it has fundamentally crumbled. We saw at the Munich Security Conference what it looked like for the security piece of that to start to crumble. We saw over the last few weeks with the tariff situation and the Liberation Day tariffs, what it looks like for the economic piece of that to crumble. Inevitably, both of these have a political overhang as well. Now, it's a little discomfiting to acknowledge this story does not start in the last few months. Indeed, over the last decade, I think we could all point to a number of examples about where we saw this order crumbling. So we saw that it was becoming less what we had expected. We saw that it was becoming less pristine. And a lot of us probably didn't want to acknowledge it, right? Thought we could repaint things or saw them or sand them or what have you. Nevertheless, I do think it is clear over these last few months that what we had had for so long really has been crumbling. It had been warped, it has now been crumbling, and that is changing a number of conversations, right? It's changing conversations about defense investments. It's changing conversations, obviously, about the transatlantic alliance. As a security specialist, I am so struck by the conversations that have been changed on nuclear weapons. And the really interesting dilemma the United States might have to start to wrestle with when close friends may decide that they no longer trust in the promise of extended deterrence. And we see questions arising about that in places across Europe, in places across the Indo-Pacific. And frankly, that just hasn't been on the to-do list for a whole lot of folks. Usually you think about what it looks like when your adversaries take those paths, not your friends. So effectively on this first point, I am expressing a lot of gratefulness for what has been accomplished over these last 80 years, and I'm recognizing that our paradigm has shifted. And that then, I think, gets to this next piece, which Camille really highlighted, in trying to understand what are we moving towards, right? What do this new paradigm look like? What are these illustrative scenarios? I thought he quite rightly highlighted the different camps across the Republican Party and the trends, which we know are actually not fresh and new. But I must say that Peter's point was incredibly compelling in terms of the almost bipolar approach of these cohorts. And it seems to me one point I would just underscore perhaps is the impact of what has been called the forever wars on the American public. Now, it is profoundly ironic, of course, given that 0.5% of America serve in the military. Most Americans have pretty hollow support of the military, and yet, nevertheless, America's military being at war for the very longest period of time in our history has engendered a profound distaste for, a real dislike for dealing with adventures abroad. One can be critical of it, but such as it is indeed, I think, a fact, and I think it very much has played a role in the president's popularity. So let us move now to our third point, which is the scenarios that Camille highlighted. And these are illustrative. We don't know that they are exactly right, but I think he does a really masterful job of helping us understand what the possibilities might look like. So there are perhaps three questions you may want to ask yourself over the coming months or perhaps years as you try to analyze what he's given us. So the first question is, how do we know which path we're on? Well, there's a couple things that you might look to try to answer that question. For example, the U.S. Department of Defense is right now doing a posture review. It's trying to see if the 85,000 or so troops across Europe make sense. Are those the right capabilities to have? Are they arrayed across the correct geography? And so you could look at the results of that. I suspect that there will be a decrease. I think the question, of course, will be the size and the scope. So that can be one sort of indicator for us in terms of which path we're on. Another is going to feel more ephemeral in terms of understanding the path, but I would argue is actually just as important, which is that convener role that the United States so often plays, right? Anytime one spends time in a NATO environment, there is this question that is asked of the United States constantly, what do you think about this? How do you think we should deal with this? And the United States often takes that role of pulling folks together and of trying to debate and get folks to agree on things that they may not have wanted to do so. So what does that look like? How do we see that on the big issues? I would note, of course, the very biggest issue right now when we are looking at transatlantic relations is Ukraine. And I think we are seeing that the United States is not playing that convener role, indeed. So that would be one question. How do we know which path we are on? The second question is, what do you want to do no matter what? No matter what of these scenarios that Camille has highlighted do you want to have done? Almost the kind of Venn diagram of overlap. There are, in my mind, two pretty obvious answers here. One is you want to increase defense spending. And the second one is you want to broaden and deeper other geometries of relationships, right? And that can help one, no matter what path the United States takes, it can help one have others sort of on the team, if you will. The third question that is in my mind in terms of telling us about kind of the scenarios is, how do you make the case to the United States? How do you make, frankly, a very selfish and self-interested case to the United States about why it should do X or why it should do Y, right? How do you make the case that this will benefit America? And I'll offer just one case study. There is obviously some loud conversation regarding Greenland, right? And it would seem that if you are watching this Iron Dome effort, this massive missile defense effort, you can recognize that, of course, what happens in Greenland, like a number of other places to be sure, is really important for America's continental defense. So what might be that case about how it benefits America to continue the status quo? Well, it seems to me you could highlight things like the U.S. military's freedom of action. You could highlight things like cost sharing rather than a burden being entirely on the United States. You could also also highlight things like, frankly, the costs in blood and treasure in occupation, right? And those would be ways to really underscore that, in fact, the status quo is pretty beneficial in a way that upending it is not. So in wrapping, I have to say, I am a bit struck that in spite of the events over these last few months, the European desire for transatlantic unity has not been fully snuffed out, despite profound transatlantic turbulence. This is, whether Europe is enthusiastic or not about it, going to be a European moment to choose which path one is going to be on. Thank you.
Fantastic. I have to say that I am now currently feeling like the Harvey Korman's character in Blazing Saddles. My mind is a whirling galaxy of ideas. And it's going to be quite hard to, sorry, that's one of my favorite movies. If you haven't seen it, you should. It's glorious. I can see our Polish friends leaving. I hope that's not because of the movie reference. No, have a good day. Good to see you. I have lots of questions, but I'm going to start with Camille and give him a right of response. But let us, if we may, focus, before we get to more practical questions, perhaps focus a little bit about the element of strategy and values. I think we have, the three of you have said in different ways, right, that there is a certain tension between the people who surround the president and the president himself, right? That the president has a businessman's approach to deal making, but that around him is an array of people who have either strategic convictions, or one might go so far as to say that they have ideologies, right? How important do we think that is for the ability, in a very vulnerable moment, which I think we all agree on, right, for the ability of Europeans and Americans to come to sort of rational deals in the way that all three of you have outlined on security, on geoeconomics, and possibly even on the relationship of our democracies? And I'll start with you, Camille. But of course, you can ignore my question and talk about something else.
Blazing saddles.
Talk about that later.
No, but let me use my experience of being a NATO senior official throughout the entire Trump's first term. So, which was a very different setup. There were many more traditional Republicans, transatlanticists in the administration that were maybe refraining some of the president's instinct and all of that. In a way, you could say, if you look at the various moments when it came to security debates, I think it's worthwhile highlighting the sort of scenarios in a way. Because at the time, we did have, the 2018 summit was not pleasant. It has been now pretty well described by a number of journalists who digged into what happened there. There was a concern then that it would even end up with some sort of a statement that would undermine NATO. It didn't happen. And the president eventually said NATO is no longer obsolete, which you can describe the notion of no longer obsolete. It's a little complicated, but it was the achievement, the moment when the Europeans felt, okay, we've turned a corner, now it's more about managing things. Is there a similar quid pro quo moment possible? I would argue yes, of course. First of all, there is a clear win on the defense spending front. Of course, it's not quite 5%, it's 3.5 plus 1.5, and there will still be debates on how much and at what pace and things like that, and we all need to wait for the document to see if it's such a clear win or not, and so on and so forth, but it is clearly coming in one shape or form, and can easily be framed as a victory in terms of turning a corner on the burden sharing debate. As Mara was mentioning, there will be decisions on the posture and whether this is a decision to really cut down super fast with a sort of cliff logic of the U.S. presence falls very quickly, or whether it's a sort of organized thing would also be a very clear element of whether we are on a path towards a stabilized security relationship or towards a more bumpy road. So my bottom line, and to use an image, is whether this is going to be like a roller coaster ride that is frightening, makes you dizzy at times, but eventually you land where you're supposed to land, or whether we have a risk of derailing by choice or by mistake the relationship there. So. For me, that's one thing. The second point, and building on Peter's point on Trump being a businessman, I think it's fair to say that he doesn't fall in any of the tribes. Personally, he has his own tribe in a way, and he operates and he will pick and choose what he sees as useful from each of the history. In a way, you could say that the appetite for a big superpower relation with Russia is very much a sort of traditional premises view of the world when other things really fall into more the restrainer or the prioritizer camp in his statement. So and in all fairness, presidents don't fall right well into theories. So that's their absolute right to not fit into a box. Having said this, I think what worries me the most, to be honest, is the combination of multiple transatlantic debates that combined together could create the recipe for a clash. We have a trade dispute that is ongoing. We have a dispute.
Well, it's not just ongoing, it will end, as per the president. We will see a desuspension of tariffs on July 9th unless deals are achieved. And right now,
yep, and this is 2 weeks after the NATO summit.
Precisely.
So we have this coming. Then we have the whole burden sharing NATO conversation. Then we have a very tough debate on democratic values and what is understood by some members of the administration and on the European side, with what is perceived, and I'll speak very openly, as interference in the domestic politics of European countries, that is quite direct. I was, as all of us, I guess, at the Munich Security Conference and listening to the Vice President's speech. I think it's the faces in the room were more telling than anything from that perspective for German colleagues. But I think it is, so again, is there a place where we sort of land where we agree to disagree on some of these things, and that would not be new? The French have had an ongoing, very tough conversation with the US on religious freedom. That is something that is not new, and that has been applied to a number of issues, and that has been very tough. It's been criticized both by the New York Times, by the religious right, by very liberal and very conservative commentators in the US. That's okay. It's fine to disagree, but does it clash with the rest to a point where we're there? And finally, and I'm sorry to be long, but I really wanted to add this. I want to stress that Ukraine is much more important than when most people think, at least in the administration, possibly in Washington. What I mean by this is that the end game on Ukraine really matters to a lot of Europeans. Mm-hmm. And if Ukraine is thrown under the bus somehow, if that's the perception, that will undermine the perception of the robustness of the US commitment, even though Ukraine is not a NATO country, for many countries that are very staunch transatlanticists. And to come back to the point of whether, is Europe going to go edge against an American abandonment, what happens on Ukraine is going to be very much of a defining moment. It doesn't mean that looking for a ceasefire and so on is unacceptable, but whether this is something that is done jointly, that ends with something that is a reasonable settlement, will matter enormously to many Europeans that would be extraordinarily disappointed, and that would break the trust they have in the US commitment, even if the rest was sort of okay. So I'm just adding this to the conversation.
All important points. And I think that I'm seeing a number of the Europeans I know in this room nodding on the Ukraine point. Although I do wonder whether many of us haven't already priced in a US disengagement. Mm-hmm. Frankly, that's my assumption at this point. Mm-hmm. And the question is then how there too, not so much, how do we get the Americans not to disengage, which I think we're assuming will happen, but how do you manage the transition in an orderly way that doesn't create exquisite short-term vulnerabilities? Mm-hmm. But let me perhaps push you on one last point, Camille, since you are our main speaker, and it's this. Mara sort of rather tactfully referred to the US role as a convener. I'm going to rephrase it slightly more brutally, which is to say that the US's role, the US and NATO, was of course always the glue that held the alliance together against fears of a German resurgence, right? Now, that was for a very long time not a realistic fear because we were disarming and very pleased with ourselves about it. Now we're doing pretty much the opposite, right? Where, as you said, we're spending an awful lot of money and very quickly because I think we're well and truly frightened at this point. That said, it still, raises the question of how do we manage in a situation where, as Peter completely accurately said, right, Europe, the European Union, the European side of NATO is very much a mosaic of capabilities, political preferences, political values. And recent elections have shown that, both in Poland and in Romania. How do we resolve the trust problem in the absence of the US?
I think it is critical, and I think Peter rightly stated that it's going to be complicated and that we have not addressed that for that particular scenario. My point would be a bit twofold. First of all, to be clear, I am with Radek Sikorski on saying that I'm more concerned with a weak Germany than with a strong Germany. I will
go on the record and say same here.
I think it is, and he said that 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's not.
You lived in Berlin. I was there.
So it is a very, very important point to stress again. Second, I think the leadership issue. I think it's basically, I would argue that what we have to invent is something somewhat different. Hopefully with the US still on board, but with the larger Europeans taking more responsibility. And my argument has been slightly different depending on the group of countries. The largest ones, so UK, Germany, France, to a certain extent Italy, need to be capable of producing some of the mass that the US was traditionally producing for crisis. So having that high readiness brigade that can be deployed overnight, for each of them. That is very demanding. That is not a simple task. The French and the Brits have been slightly better at doing this over time. But it is a, our forces have declined so much in numbers, in readiness over the years. The British Army of the Rhine in the Cold War days is larger than the entire British military combined today. So first group is that group of the large countries, which matter because simply, 1% of the German GDP is much more than 1% of the GDP of Luxembourg.
Sure.
Second, for the medium-sized countries, I think we have to recognize that the medium-sized countries need to be net contributors. That's a big debate I had with the Swedes and the Finns when they first joined NATO to say, by the way, you're not going to be consumers of security. You also need to be providers of security for the rest. You need to be able to project forces, air power in the Baltic region, in the High North. You need to be able to help in the Black Sea if needed, whatever. So that is a second group where it is interesting for those countries which thought it was okay to just have a small plug-in force into a US-led coalition to think of themselves as larger contributors. And finally, for some of the frontline countries, I would argue for the Finnish model, which was to say, okay, you need to be much more capable of defending yourself to a degree on your own, because the nature of the support coming will be different. I remember very vividly the Finns joining NATO in 2022 and saying, we have 300,000 soldiers, 900,000 in the reserve. Plus 1.2 million hunters with guns. So at this stage, I was thinking that 2/3 of the Finnish population have guns at home. But essentially, they were doing their homework. Of course, you can pick and choose and say, oh, they could do a little better in this and that. But which is a model that we've not applied elsewhere. So that's my answer.
I'm going to stop you because I want to engage Peter and Mara before we open up for questions. Peter, I think I have to address this question to you, which is that I think we, all four of us, I can imagine, as I was saying earlier, the Europeans and the Americans, the Trump administration, arriving at rational deals, right? We can, all of us, see the outlines of that. But I have to ask you, as a conservative colleague, as a self-described conservative, how concerned are you about the ideological agenda of parts of the MAGA right taking over and poisoning the groundwater here? I'm talking, of course, about the, among other things, about this State Department Substack piece that appeared last week, the outlining an alliance of civilizations with Europe that explicitly name checks the several European hard right parties, including the AfD, and as it were, explicating what J.D. Vance has been sort of hinting in his speeches, which is that centrist conservative governments in Europe are barely legitimate because they suppress the free speech of the hard right. Right? How do we, if that, and of course that was published the day before the reorganization of the State Department and the announcement that there would be now a DAS who would be charged with having these conversations in Europe with European governments. How do we prevent that kind of very overt and very aggressive interference into the European democratic space from poisoning, sane, rational debates about trade and security?
Well, I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but if Emmanuel Macron wants to make public statements about our abortion laws and J.D. Vance wants to give remarks about values and his interpretation of European democracies at Munich, I think a hard-headed assessment of the alliance can overcome that. There's a lot of talk about the Indo-Pacific being the future, and in many ways it is. But if you look at foreign direct investment flows between the U.S. and Europe and trade volumes, it far and away surpasses any other trading and investment relationship in the world. And at base, I think, underscoring that are commitments to property rights, to rule of law, all of which I think makes the U.S. a very attractive place to do business and makes Europe an attractive place to do business. So it's not that I wouldn't fret, especially as a liberal, about the values basis of the relationship. But I think as more of a hard-headed realist kind of point of view, I think we can overcome that because the relationship, the alliance, is just so important. If I can make one more comment just on a few of the other issues you raised, one being on Ukraine, there's no doubt that the administration's Ukraine policy is at a bit of an impasse, and I think they've sought to overcome that by dispatching with the shuttle diplomacy of Witkoff assigned the Russian file, Kellogg handling the Ukrainians, and pushing the Russians and the Ukrainians together in kind of a direct format. But I don't think the administration is under any illusions by having stepped back through that process from the diplomatic framework that the decisions are being made on the battlefield now, and the war is going to continue for some time. The question there is, even if the Americans pull back diplomatically, what kind of security assistance are we going to provide Ukraine? There obviously isn't going to be another supplemental in the tens of billions of dollars. There might not even be a munitions supplemental of sorts. But if intelligence sharing continues, if some key capabilities are given the Europeans, and the Europeans use that to backfill what they're sending the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian defense industrial base is an entirely different place than it was a year and a half ago. I think Ukraine has a trajectory to remain in this attritional war, even with the Americans at present levels of support for the conflict. And that doesn't even bring into question where we are on sanctions, where there's obviously some pressure from the Republican Senate to push in that direction. And we'll see what the House does, doubtlessly, either at the urging of President Trump to go for it or not go for it. And then the third point I want to make on to return to your question, but also an issue that Camille raised about NATO and defense spending in the future of the alliance. There's this much discussed interview that Tucker Carlson gave to Ambassador Witkoff on his show a few months ago. And the area that everyone focused in on was Witkoff's assessment that the Russians don't really want Ukraine. But at the end of that sentence, he says, I don't think the Russians really want to break through Ukraine. And by the way, if they do, we have NATO. So if you're a glass half full sort of person, you can look at that and say that there is at least a basic commitment to NATO, and J.D. Vance, the vice president, emphasizes this time and again. If you look at some of the readouts from the American statements from Shangri-La and the Secretary of Defense's swing through the Asia-Pacific, it's incredible. They're saying things like, you need to spend more on defense. It can't just be the Europeans who are spending 5%, 3.5 plus 1.5 on defense. Again, I think you can take a lot of heart from that, and there is a deal to be had there in perfect sort of Trumpian branding, 5 for 5. You spend 3.5 plus 1.5, 5% on defense, you get a sacrosanct Article 5 commitment. So I'd hope that that's there. Trump is a deal maker, no doubt a businessman, but as I said, he's also a populist. You can stress that term too much, but populists want to keep their coalition, and there's lots of members of the Trump coalition that he wants to keep kind of in play, which is why he doesn't really fit any of the categories, and he isn't that kind of predictable and foreseeable. But I don't think you'll see him lurching too aggressively in one direction or another. To return to my opening phase, maybe I'm too Pollyannish, but I think that's kind of my read on things.
No, I think that's sound advice, and luckily, there are more people like you, within the machine room still. But I do have to quote our colleague Fiona Hill, who now refers to this as the 5%, Article 5%, as the foundation for the alliance, which I think is.
I'm definitely going to steal that line.
Yes, that's pretty good. Well, you have to name check her.
There's a French minister who called it the Article F-35, but that's another story.
Article F-35.
I'm already, my colleagues are already waving at me to open this, but I do want to give, I'm sorry, Mara, the last word here. Mara, I was taken by your points on Greenland. I would just say that the Danish ambassador, I think, has been making these points day and night, ever since early January, really. I follow his social media feeds, and I don't think there is a single senator or member of Congress that hasn't been wined and dined at the Danish residence so far. So what do you do? What do you do when all of that sort of ends? What's your advice to Europeans? Prepare for the worst anyway, and
we're on the roller coaster, right? Okay. The difference is that roller coaster is not ending. So just accept that you're staying on the roller coaster.
Yep. Also good advice.
Right, and so if that's the case, you keep trying, you make the case, you make the arguments, right? You highlight the importance of access to Greenland while underscoring, gosh, occupation sure is pretty corrosive for a military and turns out to be exceedingly expensive. That's what one keeps doing. Can I add just one point, though, on the 5%?
I will be killed, but
it's just a reminder, the United States then also has to do 5%. And that is going to be incredibly difficult. Now, right now, the United States is just over 3% or so. There's nothing a wonky defense analyst hates more than talking about the number rather than the capabilities being invested in it. But frankly, the challenge is a lot of those capabilities just take a long time to actually deliver. So I will be profoundly curious to see what will those investments be that get the United States to 5%. When does that actually deliver as well? So maybe if we can pretend we are now tasked with the job of grading the upcoming NATO summit, what grade do we give it if it comes out with 5% for all and wonderful exclamations of unity? On one level, I suspect we might say that's pretty decent. That's an A minus, right, kind of grade. And what if also that quite limited scope involves nothing on Ukraine? It's really hard to not give a much, much lower grade in those circumstances.
Alrighty. Now, the problem here is I've been a terrible, terrible discussion manager. We have 5 minutes. I'm going to take 2 questions and then give it back to the panel. And I would urge you, if you want to stay my friend, to make those questions brief and actually have them be questions. Phyllis, and then who else? Over there, the lady. All right, I'm going to take 2 women. What the hell?
Hi, I wanted to ask 2 things about the 5%. One, Ukraine. Isn't Ukraine the biggest opportunity actually for Europe? In the sense that we're seeing defense partnerships, we're seeing partnerships there that the U.S. now is not doing. And what's the result of that 5 years from now? And also with the 5%, again, 3.5, 1.5, 1.5, put that aside because that'll be creative financing. But the 3.5, that's a tremendous increase in Europe and not that much of an increase in the U.S. because I think there's going to be. Anyway, what is the effect of that 4 years from now when we've seen this dramatic increase in Europe and not much change in the U.S. and a change in the relationship with Ukraine in Europe and not in the United States?
Right. And the lady here in the middle with the white, yeah, there it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm finding myself in the uncomfortable position of my question having been asked. But if I may, I would like to maybe build on that in asking concerning the lecture itself didn't specify in the 4 different scenarios what outcome you would expect in the Ukraine. But I was wondering whether there is a world in which you would expect the Ukraine to maybe become a more meaningful partner for European defense in the medium to long term.
Thank you very much. And would you say who you are?
Sorry, my name is Lillian Stadler, and I'm joining you from the Kissinger Center at Johns Hopkins SAIS.
Thank you very much. Okay.
All
right, and well, let's go backwards. Mara, Peter, and Camille, and with apologies to everybody who didn't get to answer a question. Blame me, as you should.
Absolutely. Very quick thoughts. The capabilities aren't going to deliver in 4 years. I hate to say it, right? So we're best case scenario. We're talking more than a decade. The interesting thing to look at is like, what is that gap? As I suspect Europeans will want to wean off of U.S. defense industry. How long does it take to really build up European defense industry to be able to meet those needs? Second, Ukraine's a fascinating opportunity, obviously in terms of defense industry, but really in terms of helping us understand the changing character of war. Of course, just look at events over the last few days along those lines. We've always known fixed bases were a challenge. Now we have to widen our aperture quite profoundly. But what we've seen in Ukraine, for example, has helped us rethink escalation management dynamics as they relate to nuclear issues. It's helped us rethink the sort of return of deterrence. It's helped us understand that a conflict can go all the way from involving proxies to conventional battlefield engagements to nuclear escalation potentially. It's helped us understand the demographics of who's fighting on a battlefield can be quite diverse and thus have to be tackled as such. Those are all really valuable lessons for the U.S. military and the European military as well. And with that, I will just say thank you.
Thank you. Peter?
For starters, I don't know when it became written in stone that you have to have a NATO summit every year. I think we end up casting about for
Meetings at the Oval.
Well, that might be a little different, but we end up casting about for deliverables, and a lot of the low-hanging fruit, I think, has been plucked on the Ukraine file already, and so you end up with a conversation that invariably ends in disappointment, and I just think, of course, it's impossible, but it made sense, I think, to have the Madrid summit. Obviously, a new strategic concept was decided, which reoriented the alliance. It made sense to ratify a new set of battle plans in Vilnius for the new dynamics of the moment, and then the Washington summit focused on implementation. Like, let's actually put rubber to the road on funding and make sure that things are moving. But now we might just become into kind of a grown to cycle of summits where we cast about for things. I will say on the spending question, I have noticed that Secretary Rubio's readouts from his calls increasingly reference the importance of a transatlantic defense ecosystem and defense industrial base. So they are aware of things like the new EU initiative to set aside the 150 billion in loans to potentially invest in defense. And if European defense budgets are growing while the Americans remain stagnant, there are a lot of American defense companies that will grow frustrated if they're not, allowed into the European defense market. And that'll be something that will work its way into American politics and already is. And then on Ukraine, I would just say Ukraine itself is the prize in many ways. They have something like 1 million men under arms, 101 brigades, incredible capabilities. And I can't say what the relationship between Ukraine and Europe or Ukraine and the U.S. will be in the coming years or how it will be different, which it certainly will be for many obvious reasons, but it's a little bit difficult to predict right now, although that'd be an interesting forecasting study to undertake. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And I think I would only add on the Ukrainian point that they're also very imaginative.
Yeah.
Camille, you have the last word.
Let me do this in bullet form to try to stay within time. On Ukraine, I couldn't agree more that Ukraine is extraordinarily important, both for European security, but also for what we can learn from that. And I really value the fact that European defense companies, but also European institutions, have been developing very, very close ties with the Ukrainians. That, assuming that there is a solid Ukrainian state in the end game, will be extremely valuable to build for the future, including in thinking through mitigation strategies in the event of a declining U.S. commitment. So I think there are tons of things to build from there, and that will be extremely important. On the 3.5%, let's be blunt. The Europeans had been underspending for so long that there is, at the moment, a feeling of pouring water into the desert, which is not true. But essentially, that what's happened with the Sondervermögen Fund, the German money, the 100 billion, people say, well, where did that go? We didn't see that. Some of the capabilities are not there yet. That's the acquisition of 35, P8, whatever you name it. Second, initially, it was a lot about rebuilding readiness, so buying spare parts, ammunition, redoing training. I mean, those things cost money, are not big ticket items, but are super important. When I was doing defense investment at NATO, I said, ministers, I've never seen a T-shirt with ministers saying, I bought ammunition and spare parts. That's the sort of things they need to do. They needed to do, and some of them are really into this. And that's it's really important to rebuild capabilities. So it's much more important than that. And then in the longer term, it's the series of things I mentioned. On the issue of just to touch on the issue of NATO symmetry, I couldn't agree more with Peter. It was honestly a fairly recent decision under Stoltenberg to try to move to a yearly path to be on par with the EU and things like that, which from my perspective is sort of absurd. There were 3 NATO summits during the entire Cold War. Since the end of the Cold War, we are more in a rhythm of every other year, and suddenly it has become necessary to meet every year. But then with the machinery still wanting the deliverables and so on and so forth. So it creates, so I'm not sure it's going to stick for forever,
even though it is not, then of course there is the anniversary stories and things like that, but it's there. And by the way, there are 5 ministerial meetings every year that used to run NATO, so it's not as if it's not happening. Finally, on the transatlantic industrial base and the industry conversation, there I would say I think one thing which is, it's fair to expect the Europeans to spend more on European industry as they grow their budget, because that's part of the deal with their own citizens, their own parliament. I would assume that the depth of the transatlantic relationship in armament will remain, because that's, if only because there are major programs that will last for decades, and I don't expect those to be cut by either side. The issue is where are we landing in terms of having a transatlantic market? I think one thing is to say we need to have supply chains and things like that that are mutually supportive, that can prove extraordinarily useful. Another thing is to say, okay, there will be competition, and that competition will continue. And I don't think that any of the EU initiatives are really damaging the US ability to have access to the market. And in a way, you could even argue, in a bit of a paradoxical way, that by sponsoring some of that, they free money for the other types of acquisition. But I think it's a conversation to have. And I'm struck, and I'll end on this, with the fact that listening to US officials these days, I get slightly different messages. I mean, there are those who, and I tend to be with that group, that say, we don't have enough resources to do everything, so it's very good that the Europeans do more on their own, and that's fine. And there are those who tend to view it through more commercial lenses and saying, oh, by the way, you're going to spend $100 billion a year, we expect $50 billion in US contracts. And I tend to believe that the first group is right, if only because there is also a capability issue. You were rightly pointing at the delays in producing many of the European equipment. I think there are also issues with the US manufacturers to be able to meet the demands of Asian, Middle East, US, and European allies.
But last point, there are just new categories of war like software where Europe has no answer. It isn't a matter of building up
Absolutely, but
infrastructure.
that's for the next one.
Sure.
This is my job. I want to say thank you and begin by thanking all the colleagues standing back there who made all this possible, who made the trains run on time, and who made it possible for us to sit here and have this chat. Our colleague who does the AV back there, our Assistant Director Ted Reinert, Caroline Grasmuck, my wonderful colleague Tara Varma, Sophie Rosa, thank you all of you for making this happen. I want to thank our French friends for both their support and their respect for our independence. I want to thank Peter and Mara for engaging with us here, and I thought giving really terrific responses to Camille's magisterial speech, and I'm really glad and very pleased with myself for saying that you would be the perfect 20th anniversary speaker. May there be 20 more years, but thank you for taking the time and giving us this fantastic speech. Thank you all for coming.